Herzlich willkommen zu Das ist Kunst, dem Podcast der Deichtorhallen Hamburg. Mein Name ist Jumoke Olusanmi. In dieser Folge spreche ich mit der amerikanischen Kunsthistorikerin Hannah Feldman. Seit vielen Jahren schon beschäftigt sie sich mit dem Werk der libanesischen Künstlerin Huguette Caland.
I love her and her spirit of both extraordinary strength and also vulnerability.
Huguette Caland ist eine beeindruckende Persönlichkeit, findet Hannah Feldman. Sie hat die Retrospektive zu Calands Werk in den Deichtorhallen kuratiert. Bis zu ihrem Tod im Jahr 2019 setzte sie sich mit ihren Malereien, Zeichnungen, Skulpturen und Texten mit dem eigenen Körper, mit Sexualität und dem Tod auseinander. Dabei ging sie sehr unterschiedliche Wege, mal humorvoll und leuchtend farbenfroh, mal nachdenklich und meditativ und immer sehr persönlich. Im Gespräch erzählt Hannah Feldman, wie Huguette Caland sich im Beirut der 60er Jahre konventionellen Schönheitsidealen widersetzte, wie sie sich in einer NGO für palästinensische Frauen einsetzte und wie sie zu ihrer sehr eigenen Sprache in der Malerei fand. Hannah Feldman lebt in Philadelphia, deswegen haben wir das Gespräch per Videocall auf Englisch geführt. Bitte entschuldigt die Soundqualität. Ich habe Hannah Feldman zunächst gefragt, wie sie eigentlich zum ersten Mal mit den Arbeiten von Huguette Caland in Kontakt kam. Bevor sie gleich darauf antwortet, eine Bitte: wenn euch der Podcast gefällt, empfehlt ihn gern weiter.
There are many stories about how I first encountered the work of Huguette Caland, and it's hard for me to remember anymore which actually took place first because it's become so mythologized in my own telling. But I first encountered her work, I believe, in a gallery in New York at Lombard Gallery, Jane Lombard. And it was at a time when I didn't really know how to see it. I kind of walked in, I was like, okay, pretty paintings, bold, bright colors. I like it, but it wasn't in the sort of repertoire of how I had understood contemporary art. And then fairly coincident, I think at the same time, I ended up sitting in on a lecture given by a man named Omar Khalif at the University of Chicago. And the first image he showed was Huguette Caland's very famous self-portrait. It's in the exhibition, but of the sort of pink bottom. And I saw it, and at that moment, on that day in my life, I needed to see that painting then. And so the two sort of layered experiences, and then it was helpful for me to confront or reflect upon why at one moment I was so receptive and the other moment I had a harder time. And I think, and why she's ended up becoming so important to me, is I had sort of been trained both through my education, my graduate study, and then through my own writing about decolonization in France and Algeria and war and violence. But I had been kind of trained not to appreciate beauty and also to avoid an emotional, affective response.
Because that was too superficial or too easy?
I think a little superficial, a little easy, also something that's easily capitalized upon for markets. So I had been trained in a kind of high conceptual art, institutional critique, politics very much front and present, but not really pronounced in a kind of activist sense. But nonetheless, every work was sort of directly about a problem, either of subjectivity or about the systems that govern the world and the art institution. So beautiful, vibrant, colorful painting was sort of that's market friendly. At least that's what I thought, and some of how I'd been trained. And then I'd spent a lot of time thinking about decolonization and more kind of activist art or art that was speaking directly to a political problem. And I'd become, by this point, it was roughly 2000 and again, I think we're in the 2014-15 period, but I'd become really frustrated with this expectation that everything had to be political. Like you walk into any gallery, any museum, and it was like, this is, I'm championing a political cause and art that's still selling for huge amounts of money, and the world is still bad, so none of this art is saving. And I just had become a little bit exhausted with art that just was ciphering my everyday reality, which was bad enough. That was 10 years ago. It's even worse now. And needed really to find a way to identify another way of having an intellectual relationship with art that allowed for some pleasure, some humor, and accessing that taught me to see painting differently and to learn to find politics in different sorts of formal operations and maneuvers. So encountering Huguette and then opening myself up in that direction really it fundamentally changed who I am as a thinker and as an art historian. So it's been quite a journey.
Wow. So she's kind of an intellectual mother for you.
And in some ways, yeah, I really, it's been a very, I've learned, so that was, I guess, over 10 years ago now, that I first kind of encountered her work and then was involved as a kind of curatorial advisor for an exhibition at the Drawing Center. And then this exhibition from the Reina Sofia kind of fell in my lap in a funny way. But it's been, 10 years of research on different continents, different archives, families, both Huguette Calands family, the studio, directed by Brigitte Caland, who's an amazing scholar and should be credited for an extraordinary body of work. She's both written about her mother, but also the work of creating and maintaining this brilliant studio and archive. And so as an intellectual mother, yes, in some ways, she brought joy back into the way that I think about art and allowed me to rethink the things that had always interested me, like language. And it's strange to think of language when you think of those gorgeous, sumptuous body parts. But throughout the whole exhibition, there's a very careful, I think, argument being made about how the linguistic sign works in relationship with the visual sign.
I would love to come back to that, but I was wondering, you are, apart from being a curator, you are also professor of history of arts at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was wondering, has her work already been the subject of a class?
I would say first that I'm really more of a professor than a curator. Sum total, I've curated 3 exhibitions in my life.
But rather big ones.
Earlier ones that I did with groups or with a colleague, but this one now, I guess, being 3 different shows, so 6 maybe. But so as a curator, I worry a little too much that I'm kind of didactic like a professor. I'm like, still learn this. Huguette has entered into a couple of classes, but I have not taught a class just on her or even really just on, I wouldn't even know where to position her as a Lebanese artist, French artist, American artist. I'm thinking of bringing my graduate seminar in the fall to the show when it moves to Los Angeles. And this year I'd actually planned to bring my graduate course, which was called Forms of Liberation and the Liberation of Form, to the Dijksterhallen to see the show. But it became very complicated because we have a number of international students and we didn't want to create a system where that was created a limitation for some. So we decided not to do it.
Would you say that it is a difference to show Huguette Caland in Europe versus in the States? Is there a different reception maybe?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I can't say so much because I think in some ways the discourse is a little bit more homogenous or unified now.
Right.
I think that within Europe, there might be differences. The Spanish reception, for example, I think is very different than the German reception.
How would you describe it?
Well, I mean, no disrespect to the Spanish, but I think in Spain, there's not as developed heightened kind of critical discourse around art. And so you don't have the same level of intellectualized response to an exhibition. I think the show is very well received and people really loved it, but I think it was a little bit more because of its novelty. It's a place where, despite long historical relations with the Arabic-speaking world, less because Spain was closed for so long, it's a little bit less a part of its contemporary history. So I think people really appreciated that opening and getting to see something really quite new. But I did feel in Spain that even the critics were really interested in reading Huguette Caland like other artists that they knew, largely American, Georgia O'Keeffe, which it's extremely interesting to me, and that has a really good place, I think, in value in the criticism and discourse. But I felt as though the critical response that I've seen in Hamburg is a lot more engaged with some of the like, we could call them the problems addressed in the work, some feminisms, ideas of selfhood as they're articulated through form. And in the States, it's hard because she was an artist who claimed, but it was also true, that she was Lebanese by birth, Lebanese by birth, French by marriage, and American by choice. And, she chose to go to the States from Paris, and she had her children, one or two of her children at the time were living there. And there's a lot about California that's a little bit like Lebanon.
Oh, there is.
Oh, topographically, let's just say. There's a decent expat community in Los Angeles, but really sort of the topographics, I think, and the climate and the sea. So, and when she moved to California in the 90s, she became very central to the art scene there. And the art scene in Los Angeles is one that I don't know as much about. It's not as sort of canonized within the global modern and contemporary art history as the New York developments. But it was a very strong, tight-knit group of people, and including, very familiar household names like Frank Gehry, who I think is a household name, and maybe other artists who are still very, very well known globally, maybe like Chris Burden, but also a number of painters who enjoyed great popularity in Los Angeles, but traveled a little bit less across the States. And she was friends with all of these people, the kind of leading avant-garde of the community in Venice, and hosted them in her studio, but was never really received well by them as an artist. Her work and her person didn't quite fit either their expectations of foreignness. It was not foreign enough, but already too different from what they were doing. And I think also it was a bit of a misogynistic world. And so she wasn't in her lifetime there received well, but it was really her exhibition in the Made in LA exhibition about 2016 that reintroduced her to that community, and then also set the stage for a number of subsequent exhibitions, including this one, kind of put her back in discourse.
So 2016, she died. In 2019, did you get to know her personally?
I can say that I met her. And by the time I met her, I was in Beirut. She was bedbound, and she wasn't able to speak at that point. But I met her with a friend and colleague. We were introduced to her by her daughter, Brigitte. She was in bed, and Brigitte told her that we were working on this show for the Drawing Center. And she was able to squeeze both of our hands. And she has, and you see it in the paintings, but extraordinary eyes. And they were it sounds very cliche, but they were so bright and sparkling that you could feel her pleasure at getting this kind of attention. My friend that was the curator at the Drawing Center at the time, Claire Gilman, and she mounted this extraordinary exhibition in New York that opened just after the pandemic. So unfortunately, Huguette had passed before that came to be. But so we didn't chat, talk about things, but I could be mistaken, but I've spent so much time now in her work and in her diaries, her sketchbooks, that I feel I know some part of her, and I'm sure I've made some parts of her up as suit my own intellectual mother needs, as you put it. But I I love her, and her spirit of both extraordinary strength and also vulnerability and determination. She worked consistently in ways that I don't think I've ever encountered anyone who, with so many privileges, she had great privilege in some ways, but also with so many obstacles and just kept doggedly day after day painting, making work incessantly for herself because she believed in what she was doing. It's pretty admirable.
So how did she come to art? I mean, you already said that she was very privileged. She had a really interesting family background, but it seemed like art wasn't really so, at first glance, so accessible for her.
So she came to art, I believe in her teens, her early years. She had taken a drawing class with a fairly well-known draftsperson who was teaching in Lebanon at the time. So there was that little inkling in her. But in her journals, her sketchbooks, and in some of the earlier interviews conducted with her, she speaks of how her parents sort of wanted her to be a writer.
What kind of writer? What did they expect from her?
One of her first professors at the American University of Beirut, where she studied painting, talks about how her parents had wanted her to be a writer, and that the stories that she wrote, or the writing, he doesn't say if they're stories or not, but it's very cinematic. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what that could have meant, because the writing doesn't exist anymore, or at least I haven't been able to access it. But I think it means that she was writing stories and describing, or sort of observations of the people around her, and describing them in fairly detached terms. So I have decided that her parents had hopes, or she understood that they had hopes that she would be a creative essayist or fiction writer. But in fact, she was in school to study to be a lawyer, and she was in a car accident, so she had to leave school. And she decided, roughly around the time of her father's death, that once he had died, he was, of course, the first president of independent Lebanon, and had been a very important advocate for its liberation from the French Mandate. And when he died, she felt herself finally relieved of the obligations to be both, the first president's daughter. He was not president at the time of his death.
But she was a public figure still.
Still a public figure. And she felt liberated from that responsibility, and from the responsibility of taking care of both her parents. Her mother had died previously, to begin doing what she knew. She sort of describes as instinctively knowing she wanted to be an artist. And for her, she describes, and others have described, how with art, you can't lie. I think with words, you can cheat, she describes, but with painting, it's harder. Like, you have to be honest, and there's no cheating. And it was a real challenge for her. And so she went to the American University of Beirut to audit art classes, and she describes to cool her heat. She had a lot of fire and energy, but sort of discipline, and learned some rules. But she broke a lot of those rules.
How old was she at that point?
She was, I believe, 34.
Okay, so she was in her mid-30s when she started to study art at the American University of Beirut. What kind of place was that? Why is there an American university in Beirut? And who was attending this university?
Excellent question. The first one, I don't know that I can answer very well. AUB is over 100 years old. There are American universities scattered across a couple of places. There's one in Cairo as well. I'm sure it has some nefarious relation to colonial powers. I should know more about the establishment of the American University. The art department I know a little bit more about. just barely. So the art department was actually established in, I want to say, the late 40s by people who had actually come from Chicago, from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, where they had been trained in a kind of American-style Bauhaus. So this weird German goes to Chicago, Chicago then goes to Beirut. So brought in a curriculum that was really very different from the French Beaux-Arts kind of tradition. So it was smaller classes, heavily based on critique and conversation, everyone working and doing all the time. And that was the environment that had been set up. She worked a lot with a man named John Carswell, who was an interesting conceptual artist. Also, he was a kind of, I don't want to say amateur, but sort of educated Islamicist. So he studied the history of Islamic art and wrote about it. And he taught these drawing classes that would feature a kind of continuous line where you put the pencil to the paper. A prompt is given, a question usually tied to something of the day, politically. Could have been topical questions, like at that moment, women's rights were very topical. But of course, the whole region was rapidly, had been sort of full of conflict and challenge and opportunity and also risk. So there were a lot of political questions about the Palestinian refugees, etc. And so you would give the prompt and it was timed, but you could not take your pencil off the paper until you had executed the idea that responded to that prompt. So already a very complicated relationship between politics and form, but drawing then that's meant to be illustrative or contouring an idea, not just a form.
So it was like an abstract concept they had to put on paper with one line regarding a political question.
Yeah. And so you see the evolution of that line in her work, and that even in her painting, which she didn't do an underdrawing, she would just paint. But the importance on contour, the way the line is soft and can modulate, the way it sometimes is hard and sharp, the way the line eventually does merge back into the written line, the silent letters. At the American University of Beirut, I think at the time it was coeducational, and at the time and a little bit still to this day, it's a very prestigious institution, and it was there were a number of elite or wealthier families would send their kids there, much like elite universities across the world. It was also a place where the history of where design was very important. Design, graphic design, was a really important part of like letters, cultured practice in the Middle East. Beirut at that time was really a center of publishing across the Middle East, and had kind of taken that mantle a little bit from Cairo. And so thinking about the graphic arts, book design, poster design, fonts, all of this was extremely important. So we believe also that Caland took some design classes, which again, you see in the early work, the kind of heavy graphic, which people like to describe in terms of pop, but I think really it's probably responding to the thing that pop was responding to. So it's her own way of incorporating or thinking about that sudden shift in the visual world where we're surrounded by certain iconographies of mass advertising, etc.
I would like to draw on that also again, but I was thinking when she entered the university, she was like in her mid-30s, we said. What did she do before that?
She was raising her children.
So she was a housewife.
She was a housewife. She was a housewife. She had help in raising her children, professional help, but she managed a house. And I should say, actually, I'm not completely being entirely true to the story. She also, she with her husband opened a restaurant, and it was a very beautiful kind of fancy spot. at which she sometimes worked. I don't think she, worked there routinely, but sometimes would serve, would greet guests, etc. Very beautiful spot, very chic, as it was described to me. And that restaurant stayed open through the Civil War, though it would close intermittently depending, where the fighting was taking place. We also know that by 67, when she began to become involved in organizing what would eventually become INASH, this NGO to help train Palestinian women in the camps around Lebanon, their own crafts in order to earn a living. So we can sort of expect that even before then, as a culture of charitable giving was starting to develop, she was perhaps involved in that world. And she was a regular, her family describes, the kids, part of managing a house in Lebanon at that time was there were many dinners, dinner parties. And so the table became a site of great exchange of ideas, intellectual, artistic culture. So I'll just say she was very, very busy in a very sort of already creative milieu, and a social one at the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because so it didn't feel like from somewhere into her lab that was already like something that was developing maybe only intellectually, but
she was breathing the air, let's say. I think, a period, Beirut in the 60s is still often described as, the kind of Paris or Switzerland. So much was happening culturally. It was the first time, art galleries were starting to open, and, her parents, though they were wealthy, but not of, in Lebanon, there's extreme wealth. They were not of that class, but they had art collections and rugs, and her mother was very interested in, those kinds of decorations. So she was surrounded by art as well. And at AUB, there's a woman named Afaf Zarek, who's an artist right now, a living artist in Beirut. And she was an undergraduate at AUB in the art department when Huguette was taking classes there. And she remembers, and she's younger, of a different generation, but she remembers hearing her laugh between, the classrooms. And that for a young artist like herself, who was sort of a little quieter, and that witnessing this joyful expression from a woman who did not conform in a very conformist society. So she had cut her hair short, and she was a little heavier than was the 60s ideal. And she didn't dress in the kinds of European fashions that her family would have preferred, but she had abandoned those clothes when her father died to wear an abaya, a loose-fitting dress, traditional in that region, but also sort of not yet associated with an upper class. It came to be, a wonderful historian of fashion has helped demonstrate actually that by the 60s and 70s, the abaya began to be a little bit fashionable for reasons connected to the shifting economies of the fashion industry. But nonetheless, she was first, so she was a little bit large, wearing an abaya with short hair and laughing, kind of gutturally, full-bodied, and enjoying herself and bringing that pleasure to her studies.
When I entered the exhibition, the first thing the first texts I read, it seemed that everyone was so obsessed with her body and with the fact that she was overweight. And then I learned after I watched the film that was also crucial for her body. What do you think what helped her to overcome this? I don't know if suffering is a too big word, but would you say that her body was kind of her material also in art?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my own thinking on this has changed a lot, maybe even sort of a longer term span of the trajectory you described. At first being like, okay, so she was a little bit overweight, and And the bodies she depicted were also curvy and luscious. But we don't need to continually focus on just that aspect of her body. But it was important for her. It was a site of, I think, both pain and suffering. But she has described and has been interviewed as describing and has written she didn't love her body, its appearance, and she battled it, but it was also a source of great pleasure nonetheless. And, she would say you see these interviews for saying that with her eyes sparkling. And we know that sexuality and sensuality were extremely important to her. I do think it was her material for a long part of her life. And that through painting, especially probably painting the Brive de Cour series, she came to become detached enough or to work through the body in both its pleasures and its what was initially upsetting to her, its volumes, its excess. But I think that she did so, I like to think in ways that were a little bit about liberating herself, like an inner self, from the confines of having to have a body at all. There's a beautiful essay in the catalog. There are two actually that are very beautiful. One talks about how it tries to rehistoricize her weight and say, actually for most of her life, she wasn't that overweight, but that it was a societal expectation. But she was at times medically overweight, I guess. But the other essay really argues for this beautiful way of trying to think of a body beyond a skin, so that the skin stops being a container and that it's about contact and the possibility of morphing and reshaping and rebecoming. And I think that's very important in the work of her earlier career. And then at the end of her life, and this people don't talk about as much, but it's fascinating to me, we see her very interested in her own body again, but it's a body it's not devoid of sexuality. We see sexuality and sensuality even in the very last paintings, but it's a body that's aging and in pain. And that's something she's definitely exploring in the Rocinante series. And in Hamburg, you're so lucky to have this only recently rediscovered sculpture where you really get a sense of how she's using her own body, like materially, to play with the paper mache, which is such a fragile medium, to depict these, humorous, but also still kind of monstrous or not normative, let's just say, bodies of creatures that are humanoid, animal-esque, and so touching, I think. And so it was important to me that the consideration of the body ended up being a consideration of, what it means really to have a woman's life. And it's a life of social pressure on the body and expectations, but those aren't the determining factors. But it's this container that moves with you as you grow, and can be, an intellectual problem, a social problem. The body is what brings you into contact with other bodies. So it's a means to community. It's a means to self-knowledge, but also something to exceed, to have greater liberation. And some people recently have talked about, that the body in her work is also not necessarily gendered in the ways that in the 60s it might have been more explicit, and now we're a little bit more fluid in our gendering. And I think we see that in some of the work, some of the Brive de Cour, but I think it's not so much that it's not a gendered body, because we see parts that we attribute to genders, but
but they morph, kind of.
Those parts can do multiple different things. They can penetrate and receive. And yes, they morph. So it's more, I think, about the attribution of what, the sort of systems of powers and understandings of pleasures. That's the thing that really opens up in really, I think, beautiful and productive ways in her painting and the bodies that it gives us. And I spent so long in the rooms, installing the Brive de Cour both in Madrid and in Hamburg. And by the time we were done in Madrid, I would walk into the room And I had, first been attracted to these paintings for their pleasure and their sort of sexiness and the color and their fleshiness. And by the end of that, I think also because of the institutionalization, what it means to hang things on white walls with proper lighting, I started saying to people, I was like, I don't see the sensuality anymore. Like, these are no longer sexy paintings. They're like rigorously intellectual meditations on form.
And that's really interesting, because I wanted to ask you if you would say that she did erotic art.
Yes, and no. And I think the erotics are located in places that I hadn't seen them before. I thought the Brive de Corps were erotic. And I guess part of that question is, what is erotic and for whom is what erotic? I think for her, they might well have been erotic, this sort of relearning, rethinking about the body, thinking about its couplings, not just sexual, but even on one's own body, the couplings of, things that are paired, breasts, lungs, inner and outer. So I think there was an erotics to painting them. And for some, I can't take away that they see them, oh, that's sexy. But I think in the drawings, we get more explicit what's described as erotics. We see, acts of sex. But they're done with such humor and sometimes other emotions. Sometimes the emotions are not all that pleasant. There's a lot of anger in those drawings and some jealousy and some frustration, that I think that the sex becomes, for me at least, like sometimes more just metaphors of something being overwhelming, something being difficult. I'm not sure, but she was a person who lived her life erotically. So yes, it's indisputably in the art, but I would say that it is not the only thing, and that it's good that the narrative is sort of opening up to allow her room to be, someone who wasn't just playful, wasn't just erotic, wasn't just happy all the time, but someone who was, as all great artists are, attached to and interested in the forms of their practice, the ideas and the larger social constructs that shape them.
We talked about the writings, and you already mentioned that, writing appears throughout her work, that letters are incorporated, that she later created the silent letters, like linear writing images. What role did language and writing play for her? Or even in her life, maybe not only in an artistic context?
We definitely see it in the work. From her very early paintings, we can see her playing with the shapes of the Arabic letter and its sort of signal diacritic, but the dots, that is what distinguishes one line in Arabic, like one vertical mark from another. So the number of dots and where they are above the line or below the line. So much so that Arabic is sometimes called the language of the dot. And I might be wrong, but in looking at her work, I began to see these dots emerge from the early paintings and start to proliferate across other canvases. But certainly in the early works, we see her playing with the shapes of the Arabic letter, but sometimes linked. Arabic is a cursive language, so all the letters are linked, sometimes linked, and sometimes not, as letters begin to break away and become stripped from their significatory capacity. So they just become pure form. And I think that idea of pure form, the line being pure form, something that was attached to expression, that language is supposed to be the thing that communicates, that brings you into community, articulates emotions. I think that's, for me, what was really important about language for her, and why and how it appears in the early works as a form. And then as she moves into her work sort of recollaging her own letters as something to be challenged, what language is even capable of communicating in terms of emotion, and then to its return, the sublimation of the form of the word or the letter, the line, as just pure graphic notation in the silent letters. She was also, I mean, it's fascinating to me, like many, diasporic people, and also many Lebanese of her class. She was trilingual. She describes, my mother tongue is Arabic. When I went to school, I began writing in French. That became my language. And then English was something she'd learned, as many school children did in her time in Beirut. She learned some English, but it wasn't a language of use. There's a film that was made that shows her in the early 70s speaking English. It's a film about Palestinian refugees. But really, English was something that she came to when she had to live in it, when she moved to Los Angeles. And she describes in her sketchbooks, what it means to try to fit into that language, the anxieties of, will I ever really have it? Will I express myself in that language? And also in the diaries, she talks about the sketchbooks, the kind of the frighteningness of the empty white page, and that she has to force herself to begin. And I think there's an analogy there also with the canvas that, there's maybe not an analogy, maybe that's it's a comparison with the canvas, where she might not have had that same hesitation because the communication became different. It's not about forming a conceived idea first through language, but it's, the bodily gesture of leaning in, painting, working with the material, and creating a communicative form that way.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that she had to force herself to begin, because she had so many beginnings in her life, right? Which were like really grandiose in a way. She started like late in some, like from some perspective, late with her art. And then she started in Lebanon, and then she went to Paris, then she went to LA, and I guess she returned back to Lebanon when she was old. So there are a lot of beginnings in her life.
There really are, and reinventions. And with each move, there are changes in the style, changes in the tenor, tone, as she's absorbing things around her, and also channeling the changes that she's experiencing through the forms that she's exploring.
What made her challenge herself so often? Do you have an idea?
One, I think she loved a challenge. She described herself as someone who had fear, a lot of fear, but had to always conquer it, wouldn't be stopped by it, that she wanted to really live life. She talks, there's a beautiful expression, she wants to eat life like, the orange all the way down to the peel, like suck every juice out of it. So I think the capacity to live and live freely, which wasn't to say she was a libertine. She was also very meticulous. Apparently she was, very proper in the etiquette, and, neat and controlled and disciplined, and the house that she designed, while having a lot of freedom. You also see the studio was, impeccably minimalist and proper. And so, all to say she was, wasn't just a libertine of, grandiose kind of indulgence and sensuality, but she wanted to live free of the constraints of any system, be it, certain expectations of art making, be it, the conventional norms of marriage, the conventional norms of mothering, conventional norms of, sexuality. She wanted to be free.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you.
Für die Freiheit zu kämpfen, das war für Huguette Caland eine Lebensaufgabe. Und jetzt noch ein besonderer Hinweis für euch. Am 23. April findet in den Deichtorhallen ein Panel-Talk über das Leben und Werk der libanesischen Ausnahmekünstlerin Huguette Calands statt. Im Gespräch sind dann die Kunsthistorikerin Hannah Feldman, der Kunsthistoriker und Autor Jumoke Olusanmi sowie die Künstlerin Huguette. Moderiert wird der Abend von der Kulturjournalistin Siri Keil. Weitere Informationen zur Ausstellung von Huguette Caland und zum Panel Talk findet ihr in den Shownotes. Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein. Und tschüss, sagt Jumoke Olusanmi. Das ist Kunst ist eine Produktion der Deichtorhallen Hamburg in Kooperation mit Byte FM. Redaktion Priska Dolling, Gabriela Basso und Matthias Schönebäumer. Die Musik stammt von Alex Blanke. Das Logodesign von Gabriela Basso. Moderation und Produktion Jumoke Olusanmi.